everyone is always impressive. You might find yourself and others nodding along and smiling and maybe even starting in your head to agree with what they're saying. Jim Jones, like many other famous manipulators, was a fantastic speaker. He was convincing enough that people left their families for him, called him their new father, and even when it came to it, would die for him. While preaching at the People's Temple, Jim Jones not only solidified the beliefs of his followers, but drug young and old hopefuls into his nightmare. Jim Jones preached at the People's Temple in the western U.S., all over. He had, I think, 16. He gained followers who had previously felt cast out and hopeless, like a lot of cults happen to do. Jones wasn't a preacher, as we might think, though. He was officially ordained, but almost every single thing he gave, every single sermon he gave, he would denounce the Bible and talk about how its followers were bigoted and terrible people. He often called himself the reincarnation of Jesus, Gandhi, and Buddha, among a lot of other religious figures. This particular sermon was given 5 years before his death in his commune in Guyana. His sermon was delivered in San Francisco in 1973 in front of at least 100 of his followers, if not 200. The clip is very loud. There's a lot of stuff going on, just a warning.
The doctor has relieved you from your work in the second row. You have a bad spinal condition.
Yeah.
And your hip is injured.
Yeah.
Step from your wheelchair. Again, step from your wheelchair. Try it. Just try it. Just try it. We have nothing to lose. We have no face to lose because we've said we're no panacea. But I have seen more healings here than I've ever seen anyplace. I love you. Jesus Christ loves you. Jehovah Jireh. All the goodness of all the world's great religions, in the name and the mercy and the goodness of Jesus, wherein I stand. Come forth, my dear. Stand up. Take that step. Bless your heart. Take that step. Take that step. Now, move forward. Move forward. Move forward. Move forward. Move forward. Move forward. You can do it. Move forward. Move forward. You have to do it. Keep my arm forward. Now, move forward. Freely, freely, freely. Now begin to exercise. Begin to exercise the joint. I love you. Christ loves you. The people love you.
That clip was one of many of his healings he did over the 10, 15 years that he was in this cult. He pretended to heal people, he really didn't, that was staged. Next, I will talk about some rhetorical devices. When asked about the worst problems in the world, he responds, we have problems of ecology, we have problems of violence, we have problems of deep-seated racism, and we have an apathy in the land, and that is appalling. He uses this repetition to make it known that these problems are widespread and affect everyone. He alludes to the King James Bible many times throughout his speech and all others. He says, I think that the worst problem, it all boils down to the love of money is the root of all evil, and we have a great deal of that today. He uses hypophora to ask himself a question that many have on their minds, and then answers it for them. How do we view the people that compromise my work? I view them as human beings from a cross-section of every kind of lifestyle. He wants everyone to know, including the news and people who doubt him, that he knows that his followers are good people and that they come from everywhere. They're not just Christians, they're not just Muslims, they're not just Buddhists, they're everyone. Ethos, pathos, and logos. He establishes credibility by using his healing portion of his congregation. In the span of minutes, he makes a blind woman see and a crippled woman walk, as we saw in the clip. This obviously didn't happen, but it really establishes that he can heal people through God, and it makes all of his followers believe him. He appeals to the audience's emotions by speaking about how they were once hateful, but are now full of love and forgiveness. He said, once many of you would not have worshipped and would not have been in the same place as people of other races, and now we have Pentecostalists, Buddhists, Muslims, gathered in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. He references many polls and statistics to back up his points using logos. He says, I read an article that psychologists say the pressure of the high cost of living causes dad to be nearly absent 95% of the time. He really puts a big emphasis on these articles he reads throughout this speech and many others. Jones's speech was significant at the time because a lot of turmoil was happening and a lot of people were really uncomfortable with all of the changes that were happening in society. Not many people outside of his cult would acknowledge that his speeches and his sermons were healing people, but the people inside wholeheartedly believed him. He gave his congregation speeches that mostly focused on love and healing and what he could do for his members that the cold world just couldn't. When his speech was given, it was probably only significant to the people listening to it and maybe the cameraman. Although it was a tragedy, this speech, like many others delivered by Jones's, continues today. You may have heard this quote from your parents, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid." That's one thing that lasted from this speech and many others he gave, because in the end at Guyana, in his commune, he fed everyone cyanide-laced Kool-Aid so they could all drop dead. And they just believed that they weren't dying, they were moving on to this brand new place and they were gonna be better people. Jones's sermon persuaded audiences into believing he was a savior, and eventually into committing a mass suicide of over 900 people, 1/3 of which were actually minors. The transcript of his speech was published on a San Diego State University webpage, easily accessible and used for religious studies. It'll probably be continued used for religious studies for a long time to come. This speech, among many others Jones delivered throughout the late 60s and early 70s, is a warning of what red flags to avoid when you're down in the dumps and looking for a savior. Thank you.